Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sabrina, and on behalf of Choice, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, From Static to Strategic, Reframing Established Digital Archives, which is sponsored by Gail, part of Cengage Group. This session is one in a series of sponsored webinars from Choice that addresses new ideas and developments of interest to the academic library community. Now, I'll just put a couple links in the chat where you can register for upcoming webinars and watch previous webinar recordings. Before we get started, I'd like to point out just a few features of the webinar software. All attendees who join the presentation are automatically muted and your cameras are off, so don't worry about generating any noise or feedback. We've got that taken care of for you. In the main area of the screen, you can follow along with the presentation materials. To adjust the size of the slides or video, you can use the divider in the middle of the screen to slide the sizes to your liking. We are using the Q&A feature today. Please use it to submit any questions or comments for our speakers. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation, so please do type your questions into the Q&A module as they occur to you. You can also use the upvote feature to highlight questions you'd like or would like to be addressed. Also, there's closed captioning available for today's session. To toggle the automated captions on or off, please use the Show Captions button on the bottom panel of your screen. You can also turn automated translation for the captions on by clicking the arrow button, toggling on translation, and selecting your preferred language. Last, please note that we are recording today's program, and everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording. And with that, we are ready to get started, so I will hand it over to Kevin.
Thank you, Sabrina, and thank you everyone for joining us today. The topic for today is From Static to Strategic, Reframing Established Digital Archives. And we are going to be discussing the space of digital archives and how librarians can reframe these collections on campus. And we'll hear from our fantastic speakers today. And have a little discussion towards the end on digital archives and reframing them into a strategic mindset on campus. So if you we could go to the next slide. I'll introduce our fabulous presenters today. With us today, we have Dr. Amy Froide, who is a professor of history at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. She currently serves as the director of the Drescher Center for Humanities, and she specializes in early modern British and women's history. She is the author of Silent Partners, Women as Public Investors During Britain's Financial Revolution, 1690 to 1750, which is published by Oxford University Press. Professor Froide also was the recipient of the 2018 Maryland Board of Regents Award for Teaching Excellence and is currently the University of Maryland, Baltimore County's Presidential Teaching Professor for 2024 to 2027. Also joining us today is Dr. Karen Limper-Herz who is the head of the printed heritage collections at the British Library in London. She is a fellow at the Society of Antiquaries and an honorary secretary at and senior vice president of the Bibliographic Society of London. She's a faculty member at the Rare Book School at the University of Virginia and a trustee at the Herzog August Bibliothek and a member of the organizing committee of the AEB in Berlin. Both of their experiences will offer, we gathered them today because I think both of their experiences offer some unique perspectives to share with librarians about digital archives from both the faculty side of things and an end user and using these collections in instruction and in research, and Karen's expertise in creating and curating collections and her deep knowledge of rare books offer some really interesting perspectives. So with that, I will progress to introduce the challenge of what we're discussing today. And then after that, I will hand it over to Amy to present, then Karen will present, and we will discuss after that. Just to present the challenge, what we're talking, why digital archives, why reframe digital archives. This is, I think I may be preaching to the choir, or some of these things may be common knowledge to the librarians to the folks here. And some of these things might not be framed exactly how it is at your campus. But with traditional archives, we see, we want to share the things that we hear from customers in terms of the challenges in getting new archival collections, or just getting usage of the collections they have, and getting momentum around these collections to get everyone to understand the unique value of historical digitized material. So the traditional viewpoint is archives are often perceived as passive repositories, very valuable, but disconnected from strategic institutional goals in a way that is different from other library resources, things that might, other things that the library might subscribe to. There's all evolving expectations of what academic libraries are supposed to do. The role of the library on campus is never the same. It's always kind of evolving. And with that, academic libraries are increasingly asked to demonstrate alignment with those broader priorities and align to these strategic goals of that universities have, whether that be research excellence, student success, or community engagement. And why we're talking about this today, and I think it's something that many librarians talk about with primary sources, I know at least from the Gale perspective, working close with them, we talk about it a lot, is that they are, the strategic opportunity that reframing these collections can provide. Not only new collections, but existing collections, like 18th Century Collections Online, which now has a 20-year history within many research archives. Reframing these collections as not just static repositories, but things that kind of continue to support research, continue to evolve with research needs, and something, reframing these collections in the eyes of the faculty members and administrators to understand the value of these. They can support curriculum innovation, foster faculty collaboration, and enhance institutional storytelling and the institutional identity around, the library and the research output and the resources available to the school. So that is the summary of the challenge that we are going to kind of be discussing today. And with that, I will hand it over to Amy to kind of discuss her perspective as a faculty member on digital archives and how their role in evolving scholarship. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kevin. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Welcome, everyone. I think we've got a nice big audience today. I'm a faculty member, so I'm going to be speaking from my perspective. I'm at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and we have always been a research institution, but we recently became what is called R1 in the Carnegie classification system a few years back. And I'd like to give a shout out to our librarians at UMBC in the AOK library who had the forethought to realize that with our research standing, that our digital resources needed to be increased and beefed up so that we could achieve that research excellence. And so working with those librarians, I had been a big advocate for some of the digital resources in the areas of my scholarship, but also areas of others in the history department at UMBC. So Gale resources have been really critical to me as a British historian, someone who's a women's historian, and someone who is really in their last few books focused on economic and financial history. And so I want to talk a little bit about how I've used Echo resources in the past, and then I've had the chance to play with the Echo 3 demo and talk a little bit about some of the things that I think are going to be added and that I can do differently because of the new resources coming online. So as Kevin nicely said in the introduction, my last book, Silent Partners, was about women investors in the first English stock market. So women who were public investors investing in national endeavors, corporate endeavors. And I went back for this webinar and looked at my bibliography for Silent Partners. And I found that I used 46 printed sources from Echo. Actually, probably many more that I looked at, but 46 in the bibliography. And that made up about a third of my bibliography for that book. So I can't really understate, I want to overstate maybe the importance of 18th Century Collections Online to my research. I think a lot of people who maybe don't know a lot about Echo may assume because it's the published resources from the 18th century that it leans literary. And it does. I mean, there's certainly wonderful literary collections in Echo, but I'm a historian. As I said, I'm an economic historian. And so I may use sources in Echo that not everybody's thinking it has. One of the things I was looking at when I was researching women investors, for instance, were sometimes literary sources, ballads, poems, plays about the stock market, investing, the South Sea bubble. We might expect that. But I also used a lot of what I call financial literature. So, bookkeeping manuals, arithmetic guides, investors' manuals. And those are literary, but maybe not in the way that we often think of that term. I also used a lot of court cases, and in the 18th century, thank goodness for historians, court cases are often published, or versions of them are, and so I use those as well. But probably one of the most important sources for me were lists of company investors and stockholders. And again, those were published lists, so those appear in Echo. And that actually was my raw data for proving how many women invested in the 18th century. I could pull up the subscriber list and count how many women were listed there. So those were incredibly important. I'm now moving toward a new project where I'm working on a particular financial scandal in London in 1732 involving what's called the Charitable Corporation. And this corporation gets in a lot of trouble, and there are a number of parliamentary investigations. And guess what? All of those investigations are published. And so I'm able to get at the investigations into this fraudulent company through Echo once again. So I want to emphasize that those of you who might use financial literature, legal literature, things that political literature will also really benefit, I think, from Echo. I also used hundreds of newspapers and journals. Those aren't necessarily part of Echo, but they are part of other Gale products. So I would say that the newspapers were very integral to my research. As I said, I'm moving forward on a new project on the charitable corporation. So I thought, why don't I check this new rollout of Echo Part 3, which I think we're going to hear more about how that was compiled and how that came together, and see what is new in this new collection. And one of the things that I noticed right off the bat is there were a lot of hits for the charitable corporation. So I identified about 40 news sources that I either had seen other iterations of or hadn't actually used before. And many of these were reports related to the charitable corporation. So there were so many, I think, that sometimes they ended up in different repositories. And so adding new repositories in part 3 means that I get new data. I was also excited to see that because in Echo 3, there is a better digitization of maybe non-standard size sources and of images, that I actually found a few new broadsides and a few new image collections that I wasn't aware of for my project. So that made me excited. I'm also seeing in Echo 3 an increase in almanacs that have been digitized. And almanacs often record important events in a timeline or chronology. And it helps me make my case for why the charitable corporation scandal was so pertinent in the 1730s, because many of these almanacs list the charitable corporation scandal as one of the key events of the era. So it's not me saying it's important, contemporaries thought it was important. And I'm also noticing that there are a number of book lists or book catalogs that seem to have been added in Echo 3. And again, that can give me a sense of who's buying material about the charitable corporation. How common is it in somebody's library? So just with a really, admittedly cursory look, I've been able to establish new research avenues for myself. I already was heavily using the standing Echo collections, parts 1 and 2, but now I know there's going to be some new material for me as well. One of the things about the new collection is there's also an increase. I think you Gale folks are talking about the increase in materials, talking about the Atlantic world and about expansion. What I notice is there's an expansion of resources pertaining to Scotland. And, most of us these days teach English and Scottish or British history. And so the increased number of things I'm seeing from the National Library of Scotland, I think is a really wonderful addition to those resources, and something I hope to see going forward, right? That we aren't just privileging English sources to some extent. So I think with this new collection where more broadsides are included, more maps, larger volumes. As a historian of finance, I'm often using large letters and accounting books. And so large volumes, large folios are actually at the kind of core of my research. It's good to know that we are now able to scan those type of items. Now, you may say to yourself, why does Amy Froide need to consult these resources on Echo? She's a British historian. Can't she go to Britain and look at these things? And I love to go to Britain. I love to do research there. Now that I'm friends with Karen, I'm going to be hanging out with her at the British Library. But but sometimes you can't actually, as a U.S. scholar, get to your sources, and whether it's the UK or Europe or other parts of the world, as much as you would like to. And so having these sources available digitally allows me to conduct my research not just in a 10-day trip to the UK in the summer, but throughout the year, which increases my research productivity. It's also very helpful to have resources available, for instance, at different parts of our academic life cycle. So if you have young children and you can't travel, you still can do your research. If you are limited by administrative roles, which is something I've seen over the last decade or so, can't get away as much, again, I can still engage in my research. So it really allows, I think, especially folks who are not near their archives, a way to stay engaged, a way to be participating in dialogue. And I can also say that as an instructor, being able to assign echo sources allows me to do a lot more in the classroom and allows me to teach graduate students in a way that, again, can be difficult in the United States if those students are studying Britain, in my case, if they're studying with me, or other parts of the world. So this allows us to really allow our students to do, I think, much more robust, interesting, interdisciplinary, transnational projects as well. So I think I'm going to end it there. Am I over time, Kevin? Or did I keep to time? I'm going to end
No,
that.
you're fine. If you have more that you'd like to share, we've got time, or we can you can share more thoughts when we get to the discussion and Q&A. I would love to hear more about the instruction piece of it, but if you would like to save
Uh,
that for discussion, we can.
I can do either. I will say I'm super excited about an assignment that I've created for the semester in my Age of Enlightenment course, which involves students having to curate or create their own Enlightenment library. And so they are going to have to choose titles from Echo that someone, and they get to pick who their person is, would be collecting in the 18th century, and explain to me why this is an Enlightenment library. So this could be a political philosopher, this could be a salon, a female saloniere, who they are thinking of, and then they're going to curate a library with the titles from the collection. So I'm really excited to see how that works out. And I was inspired actually by going to some Gale webinars and thinking through how I could use the resources in the classroom to do some new things. I'm always looking for new projects and new new research paper topics, I guess we would say. And I thought this might give them a little bit of a choose their own adventure. I think students really like to be part of the process of choosing what they're going to research and what they're going to work on. And so that's something that I see coming up, and I'm happy to report back how it goes. It's in the influx there. The last thing I would say is I really, as I said, benefited from working with my librarians, and I would like to urge librarians and faculty to really work together to think about what are the resources we need at our institution? How can we really amplify what we're doing by being judicious in what we are choosing? When budgets are tight, I understand maybe we can't have everything, but I think that all institutions probably have some areas that they really could increase research and scholarship in if they had access to some of the digital resources that Gale and admittedly other companies have available. It's a conversation I think I would like to see faculty and libraries having together more and collaborating on, because I think we both want to do the same things. We don't always know what the other person's thinking. So I have benefited from those conversations myself. So I'm going to leave it there, and I'm happy to answer
Yeah,
questions later.
that's awesome. I love that that activity for students. That sounds like a really interesting way to kind of force them to triangulate themselves within the sources and like get a sense of what it really put themselves in the shoes of someone in the 18th century. So thank you so much. That was super interesting, and we'll definitely want to hear more about it. And of course, we are always the library and faculty collaboration is, it can never be a bad thing. It always, I think, is good to know what the other person is thinking or the other stakeholders are thinking. So that's always a great thing. And Karen, if you're ready, if you want to, if that's a good segue to talk about your role in curating these collections on the other end of things, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Amy. So I'm going to talk about something completely different, and that's the British Library's perspective, sort of like the macro view of what we're talking about here, I suppose. And I'm probably going to start with something that's slightly off, but let's see. I mean, off what main topic, but not really, I don't think. So the British Library London holds one of the most comprehensive collections, if not the most comprehensive collection, of 18th century English printed material in the world. It was thus perhaps not surprising that following the publications of A.W. Pollard and G.R. Redgrave's short title catalogue of books printed in England, Scotland, and Ireland, and of English books printed abroad, 1475 to 1640, STC, and Donald Wing's short title catalogue of books printed in England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and British America, and of English books printed in other countries, 1461 to 1700, Wing, the continuation of the short title catalogue project or idea to cover 18th century English language publications, this time in electronic form, was to be based at the British Library, at least in part. In June 1976, a conference took place here in London, jointly sponsored by the American Society for 18th Century Studies and the British Library. At this conference, plans began to be made for a machine-readable union catalogue of books, pamphlets, and other ephemera printed in English-speaking countries from 1701 to 1800. The 18th Century Short Title Catalogue, ESTC, was born. In 1977, an ESTC team was established here at the library, and work began on cataloguing the library's extensive holdings of material in scope for the new short title catalogue of 18th century English language material. From the beginning, this was a collaboration between the British Library and ESTC North America, and an American team cataloguing for the 18th century short title catalogue held in American institutions was established a couple of years later. The 18th century short title catalogue was a pioneer in being a machine-readable catalogue, and it was made available by the British Library's Blaze system in 1980, and then accessible in the US Research Libraries Group's Arlen system in 1981. Realizing that the future of short title catalogues was online, the International Committee for the 18th Century Short Title Catalogue approved in 1987 the extension of ESTC backwards to the period covering 1473 to 1700, to incorporate the printed short title catalogues STC and Wing. This necessitated a title change for the catalogue, and the 18th Century Short Title Catalogue became the English Short Title Catalogue, conveniently allowing it to retain its familiar acronym ESTC. A couple of years later, the American ESTC team began the process of cataloguing pre-1701 printed material, and in the mid-1990s, the British Library followed suit and began the detailed cataloguing of its pre-1701 in-scope holdings. With more detailed records being created for pre-1701 items, the same standards were soon applied to 18th century material as well. In 2006, ESTC moved to the British Library and was made available freely to an international audience for the first time. Discussions about future developments and possible new hosting arrangements started in 2021. And since May this year, ESTC has been hosted by the Consortium of European Research Libraries, or CERL. It continues to be managed jointly by the British Library and ESTC North America, as it has been since its foundation in the 1970s. ESTC is now the International Authoritative Union catalogue of books, serials, newspapers, and selected ephemera printed before 1801 in Britain, Ireland, overseas territories under British colonial rule, and the United States after 1776. So why am I telling you a brief history of ESTC when we're meant to be talking about ECHO, and in particular about ECHO 3? Well, because it is ESTC that lies at the heart of ECHO 1, 2, and now also ECHO 3. Since the first phase of 18th Century Collections Online, the catalogue records in ESTC have provided the metadata for ECHO, and they have done so once again for ECHO 3. You could say that with its digital images, or microfilms for ECHO 1 and 2, and now of the physical items themselves for ECHO 3, ECHO is a natural offspring of ESTC, both dependent on it and yet also capable, and very much so, of existing on its own, taking users into new areas of research by providing access to fully searchable texts. When talking to researchers today, we often find that they're unaware of the close connections between ESTC and ECHO, and I therefore wanted to take this opportunity to remind everyone here of this close and ongoing link. With the addition of ECHO 3 to the family, researchers are now able to access fully searchable images of the vast majority of the 18th century part of ESTC, opening up a vast array of new research opportunities and areas of study. ESTC itself, on the other hand, is now increasingly also of interest to researchers as data, which can be interrogated and interpreted at scale. Using the two together opens up unprecedented access to the output of 18th century printing shops in the English-speaking world and the enormous range of information that shaped life and society during this particularly exciting time of change and development. The British Library has been a key contributor to ECHO from the very beginning, and its collections form a very large part of the titles included in ECHO 1, 2, and now in ECHO 3. The latter will provide access to another 1.7 million new pages of content from the collections held here at the library, adding to the total of 32 million pages already available in ECHO 1 and 2. The world has, of course, moved on significantly since the launch of ECHO 1 in 2003 and that of ECHO 2 in 2009. While the first two portions of the resource were based mainly on the black and white scans of sometimes decades-old microfilms, often leading to less accurate search results caused by inaccurate optical character recognition, ECHO 3 will contain new full-color, high-resolution images of British Library material, adding significant research value and making the library's collections more widely available to audiences around the world. Due to significant changes to the scanning process over the years, ECHO 3 has also enabled the library to digitize some of its more delicate, large format or otherwise difficult to scan items. Continuing to work with Gail on this project has also been an opportunity for the library to get a large number of additional 18th century printed books digitized, which could not be included in ECHO 1 and ECHO 2 for a number of reasons, including the fact that they had not been microfilmed. ECHO 3 also includes images of titles the library acquired over the last 20 years or so, thus making them available in digital form for the first time. For the library, digitization in general and the digitization of popular and frequently requested items in particular is an important collection management tool. 18th century printed books, often inherently fragile, are used in our rare books and music reading room by an international community of researchers every day. And the ability to offer fully searchable images, so many of them now in one place, is invaluable for researchers and ultimately also for the books. For some of our very fragile items, for example, the creation of high-quality digital surrogates enables us to point researchers to those in the first instance, making available their content, but protecting the physical items from overhandling. This, in turn, allows the library to preserve the physical objects in perpetuity, to continue to be able to make them available to those researchers whose work requires direct interaction with the originals. Given the sheer scale of the library's collections, around 2.6 million British and Irish titles printed between 1501 and 1900, the opportunity to digitize sections of them in collaboration with others is very important. Such collaborations, of which the one with Gale around 18th Century Collections Online is one of the longest standing, allow the library to provide online access to an ever-increasing number of items in our collections more quickly and on a larger scale, thus unlocking their secrets for existing and new audiences. Since the release of Echo 1 and 2, research topics have probably changed and evolved as quickly as digital technology and researcher needs. This has enabled the library to include new material in the soon-to-be-released latest phase of Echo, including, for example, and Amy's already mentioned this, single-sheet items, but also to add material previously underrepresented or unrepresented, such as English language titles printed in the West Indies. The inclusion of more and different material in Echo 3 also makes the collection a more accurate reflection of developments that took place in the 18th century, for example, in terms of printing and bookmaking, the development of reading habits, and changes in society as a whole. It thus allows researchers to build a more comprehensive picture of life and the exchange and consumption of printed information in the 18th century. Speaking as a book rather than a textual historian myself, the inclusion of full cover-to-cover digitization will be invaluable. While the focus was previously mostly on texts, and this research need is still met, an increasing focus has now shifted to copy-specific information, such as provenance and bindings. This, in turn, has also had an impact on the way books are now digitized. Through the inclusion of cover-to-cover digitization, Echo 3 will thus be of use to a much broader research community interested in texts, but also interested in objects, and will help us ask different questions of the material presented to us in digital form for the first time. High-quality color images will also unlock more of the secrets the books hold, as optical character recognition will be far more accurate on these images than it has been on digitized microfilms. I'll now briefly talk about the process of digitization for Echo 3 here at the library. The titles for inclusion in this section were selected based on the representation of British Library collections in the English short title catalogue. The library received a long list of titles which Gale wished to digitize from its collections. This was shared with my team of curators, which is responsible for Western books printed between 1450 and 2000. My team was then involved in preparatory phases, for example, by checking the list of titles sent by Gale and adding shelf marks or answering queries where necessary. Once the list of items had been signed off by the library, digitization began, with the Gale team based in-house, making the movement of collection items from storage to studio and the entire workflow much more efficient. Gale hired photographers and conservators as well as staff to retrieve the physical items from the shelves, so that reasonably large numbers of volumes could be processed in short periods of time. Items were initially checked for condition and thus their suitability for digitization at shelf, and those identified as requiring minimal repair to make them fit for digitization were brought to the conservation studio for treatment before they went to the studio for imaging. For the collection items themselves, their inclusion in Echo 3 has thus been beneficial, because not only will the library be able to make available digital images of them from next spring, but many of the items are also in a slightly better physical condition than they were prior to being included in the project. Curators from my team were involved in the process throughout. For example, when queries arose around shelf marks or storage locations, or when items which require curatorial approval prior to retrieval were to be digitized. The library has multiple roles when it comes to 18th century collections online. In its role as joint manager of ESTC, for example, it has always been involved in the provision of catalogue records, thus metadata, to Gale. In being a major contributor to the resource and continuing its collaboration with Gale, it helps unlock its own collections for a larger and more diverse audience on site and worldwide. And in continuing to provide access to 18th Century Collections Online in its reading rooms at St. Pancras and Boston Spa, the library offers this ever-growing resource to its users every day.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Karen. That is, I love the perspective, the history of the ESTC, and kind of showing that these collections are, almost the culmination of thousands or hundreds of years of collection and bibliographic work from librarians. So that's fantastic. So thank you so much for sharing that.
I thought it might be helpful to kind of remind everyone that there is this close link, and how they do still talk to each other, and how actually using them together is probably in a way more powerful than using them separately, let's say, to answer a wide range of questions.
Totally. Yeah, I think that's a super interesting, a great reminder for folks with these collections. And I think it's also just showing that this, from the meeting with ASEX and the ESTC folks years ago, and just this evolution of technology and what we've allowed ourselves to do with these materials as things have gone on is fantastic. So that's I really appreciate you offering that perspective for us today.
I must say, I'd love to know what those involved in the conference would think of us talking about this now, and what happened.
Yes.
What was built on what they essentially conceived in the 1970s.
Yes, yeah, it's super fascinating, just like how it's evolved and gotten bigger, or just more facets, more ways to interact with this material. It's really phenomenal, and just the fact that it's built off of the bones of that metadata that was created so long, the things that were documented so long ago is very cool. So with that, I would love to turn it over to the discussion portion. I have a few kind of starter discussion questions of things that I think will be valuable to the audience to kind of hear both of your perspectives on. So I will start with those. And then if folks want to start putting some questions into the question and answer. And we also have, if you guys are interested, Amy mentioned bursting the South Sea bubble. You can learn more about Echo 3, we have a video on the digitization efforts and the conservation efforts that went into the creation of the collection. You can go to www.gale.com /echo-III to view those things, learn more about the collection. And we have this awesome story that uses sources from Echo that kind of takes you through the narrative of the South Sea bubble. If you haven't heard of that story, it's very interesting, and just a cool thing to look through, and some awesome visuals in there as well. So yeah, if folks want to enter in some questions that they have for folks, I will start reviewing the questions. I have a couple that we're going to get started with, and then we'll get to the Q&A questions as we go through, and I'll mark those off. I think folks have the ability, if you don't want to ask a question, but I believe you have the ability to upvote questions if there's ones that you think are relevant to you, and you want to make sure that we get to those, feel free to upvote those. So my first question for both of you guys, I think, is what advice that you might give to the librarians on the calls, or librarians generally, to demonstrate or communicate the impact and the value of digital archive collections, and not just Echo 3, but obviously we're talking, or not just Echo, but in digital collections and digital archive materials in general. What recommendations can you give to librarians?
I can start off with that, Kevin. I mean, I talked about some of the things that I think make digital collections important: their accessibility, the fact that you can do research, kind of at your institution, and not have to travel. The other thing I think is making sure that people understand, for humanities scholars, that this is our lab. This is how we do our research, is we read and analyze sources, so we need access to them. And I really like that Gail is, got the Digital Scholar Lab going. Kind of basically, I think sometimes we need to show what we do with these sources a little bit better. And so any kind of concrete examples, I think, can be very useful for communicating the need for these sources. That it's not an extra. It's actually the very lifeblood of our profession for many of us in history and literature and other adjacent fields. So I think I would ask librarians and faculty to work together to think about how to tell that story a little bit better. And I think this is a great moment for talking about that today. But I think every institution probably has examples of that. As a director of a humanities center, I'm always trying to show how the work gets done to get to a book or an article or a website, right? It doesn't just appear out of nowhere. And
Totally.
so I'm really interested in showing our process a little better. Yeah, I'm always struck by a lot of people don't know what it looks like to, in my case, do historical research. What does that look like? What do how do you interact with the sources? How do you work with them? Hopefully we're doing that in the classroom. So maybe it's also bringing in our librarians into the classroom and vice versa to talk about that.
Love that. I love that perspective. Thank you. And Karen, did you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, to me, digital resources are an addition to the physical, and they broaden access, I suppose, democratize access to the originals very much so. I mean, if you are, I suppose, privileged to be able to access original material, that's one thing. But the digital, I think, adds another layer because you can look at so much more, and you can also work with that material so differently than you can work with material, with physical material in a library, for example. And it's, it is, as Amy's already said, it's being able to access the material when you want it and when you can access it, when you have the time rather than have to travel, for example. And it allows us, the more there is, I think the more questions we can answer based on this material, and the more questions we can ask it, so to speak. So, I mean, for me, it's an essential part of research now. And it tells us something that the physical doesn't tell us, but to me, they're very much complementary. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think you kind of answered one of the questions that was in the Q&A, which was why do researchers need direct access to the original documents if the documents have been scanned into a digital format? Which I think you've answered there, is that you can do very different things with them, and that they play off of each other. You can find things with the digital version and then see it in person and react to it a different way. But yeah, I
they
think
do.
that's
I mean, to me, that the digital doesn't necessarily replace access to the physical, but for some things, it 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 can be used as a substitute, and it's a perfectly adequate substitute. It really depends on your questions, and you will have a more intimate, I suppose, interaction with the physical object because you're looking at it, on its own, so to speak. Whereas if you look at it in digital form, you look at it in a much bigger context of other similar or somehow related items. And you can also come across items that you never thought existed or potentially related to your research. But if you do focus on a physical item only, then you kind of need to work a little bit harder to make that context. But I mean, there are questions about, size and materiality that you ideally really do want to see the real thing for. Yeah. And I mean, that's what we very much do here. And some of the questions, I think, where you have digital technology and the physical kind of talking to each other, that's a really brilliant opportunity, because sometimes the digital can enhance what you see in the physical, but also vice versa. So you can see a shadow of something in the physical. The digital might give you a clearer picture. Or vice versa. You don't quite understand what you're seeing in the image. You look at the real thing and then you understand. So I think the two are very much interconnected.
Yeah.
I think if I could add to that, Karen's exactly right. What Karen said is really important about how the digital images became available for Echo Parts 1 and 2. Many of those were based on microfilms, right? And Echo 3 is more born in this more advanced digital age. And so from my perspective, my colleagues who are interested in things like marginalia and spines and paper, they couldn't even access that with just a microfilm scan. They might be able to access some of that now, right, with these new improved color scans. But it would probably be more a preparatory work to then figure out what physical copies they had to look at. So you can kind of think of it as a two-step process, right? The digital and the original copies can do different things, but you can do a lot of preliminary work too, and then know exactly what you need to go into and look at physical.
Super. That's awesome. I just thank you guys both for that. Is I think the unique perspectives on the physical versus digital and how those things work together is always super interesting. I have one more. I think a few of the questions, I'm looking at the chat now. There's a few questions I see are one of the editors of Echo is in here answering live. So thank you, Eleanor, for that. I will let her answer some of these more technical about the specifics of what's in Echo 3 that myself or the other folks on the call might not have answers to, but I will prioritize. There's a question I think is a good one for you guys is what criteria do librarians follow in deciding what material to digitize or not digitize? I know it's a big one. Karen, if you want to take that on.
Yes, I can try. I mean, I think it's a very good question, and it's almost like, where do you start? It depends a little bit on how big your project is, who you're working with, whether you're doing it on your own, what the aim of the digitization project is. I mean, in an ideal world, do we want to digitize everything? I don't know, maybe. I mean, I suppose that's a completely different discussion. So if we're talking large scale digitization, there is depending on what you want to do, if you need to meet numbers, then there are criteria about where can I get that material or where can I get those numbers quickly. Then there is physical condition. So material needs to be in a stable enough condition to be able to be digitized, unless you have built into whatever project you're working on the ability to have material conserved before it's digitized, which sometimes is the case and sometimes isn't the case. If you're working on a, say, small-scale bespoke digitization project, say driven by philanthropic funding, then you're very much working together with possibly the funder on what their aim is. So the criteria do really vary. I think they change quite a lot, depending on what kind of project you're after. So, I mean, I could probably say like two things that we've done here. So we digitized our two bits of our incunabula collection, so pre-1501 printed material, where we digitized the English incunabula because we're the British Library and we have the biggest collection, I suppose, and also it was an obvious place to start, but also the unique incunabula, so places no one else has copies of these incunabula, so we wanted to make those available for free to an international research audience, and actually we managed to make those available during COVID, which was particularly brilliant because we could actually do research on items they would not have been able to access physically. Another thing we are looking at, or we are digitizing successively, is material that we have restricted, say, for condition reasons. So where we can make the material available, thus possibly postponing conservation treatment slightly, but making available the real thing, the digital images sooner rather than later. So I think it's quite an open question, and there are lots of different answers depending on what particular project you're looking at, I think.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting, it is kind of getting into the weeds of how you even consider that question when you're starting a project of defining scope of something like this. But that's very interesting. Another question to keep we have that I think would be interesting is can you share an example of how a single archival item or a collection, a new, and this is maybe for both of you guys, about how a single archival item or collection sparked broader interest or research activity? And I'm thinking, Amy, from your perspective, if you have an example of students coming across something, or even yourself finding an archive or finding something that you didn't previously know about that kind of put you down a path? And then Karen, if you have any examples of things that, I don't know, maybe you've curated or helped create that kind of opened up new areas of research that weren't previously available.
I think that that is actually one of the benefits of these collections is you always kind of end up going down the rabbit hole a little bit. You find something, it leads you to other things. And so it's I think the main thing is to give yourself time and the kind of the permission to do a little bit of that searching around and have some fun. I try to tell my students that when they give them an assignment, don't just choose the first thing you find. Look around, look more broadly, and then you might decide that the first thing you found is the best thing you want to talk about, but there may be other things alongside it. And so, feeling comfortable with that. I had a recent assignment with some students. They were looking in a database and they were shocked to find things they didn't expect. And then that's the moment where I think you get that engagement with students where history isn't what I thought it was, right? It's more complex or it's more messy or it's more intriguing and we always joke and that students always think that everybody in the past was so serious, that somehow we're the only people today who've ever thought of humor. And so I think it really surprises them when they see humor in the past and they see bodiness in the past, and real human emotions and human affect, right? And that can come through, I think, in these kind of collections in a way that maybe doesn't always happen in certain other kinds of records. And so I think, again, as a director of a humanities center, I'm thinking a lot about how do we value and show the relevance of the humanities, and it's building an understanding of value for human empathy. And I think there's a place for searching these what seem to be very distant kind of time periods and really uncovering a humanity there. So that went a little bit off in a direction I don't
No,
think that the panelists
I think
expected.
I think that was great. I think it's super interesting of just hearing, just giving students that history is now a mystery for them to solve, like that they have something to search out and that they can be a part of it and searching out information that wasn't previously known or not known as well as they can seek out the information. So I think that is super interesting.
I think it can be daunting for students to know how to search, right? So
Mhm.
I do think that all the work that Gail's doing on kind of helping think through, how do you create a search term and how do you, adapt it and refine it and things of that nature are really important because it can be daunting at the beginning, but there's so much richness that they have at their fingertips. So I love the case studies, actually. I think that really helps explain.
That's awesome. I'm glad that they are doing what they're made to do. So that's awesome to hear. And Karen, did you have thoughts that you wanted to offer on?
Yeah, I don't have a specific example, but perhaps when I talk to students here, so we have student groups visiting the library obviously quite regularly, and we as curators get involved in talking to them or giving them a session about early material. And it's usually for me a combination of talking about real physical things, but also talking about online resources. And I always use the online resources as a way for them to access that time period, but to also access it in a way that makes it slightly familiar to them. So to not just think, oh my God, that's the 18th century, that's so long ago, there's nothing that's possibly linked to today. So I usually get them to think about, events that happen today. I don't know, protests or something like environment, for example, and get them to search for something like that. And then I find when they make a link between what they're concerned about today and the past, they're off. So they're much more likely to, kind of get stuck in and look for something. And then I also remind them that obviously there is lots out there that's digitized or digitally available in some form, but not everything is. There is so much more that isn't. But if they can kind of hone their skills, their searching skills by using digital resources, they're probably more likely to actually hit something in the kind of physical world that relates to their interests at a later stage in the process.
That I love. That's super interesting of the training aspect of it for. But awesome. Thank you guys. I'm trying to think of and looking at these questions, and there's a couple big ones that I will ask this for you. There's a specific question for you, Karen. I think this might be one of our last ones, is if you have any particular insight into how these cover to cover high resolution digital surrogates are changing bibliographic studies in particular, or changing how the library interacts or services with those doing in-depth bibliographic descriptions, which is, yeah, I'll hand it over to you.
That's a very interesting question. Thank you. How does it change bibliographic studies in particular? I think it opens them up in a way. So it shows people something that they might not have been aware of was there before. So the object as a 3D physical thing. So if I'm not talking as a book historian, but if I'm talking as someone who's, say, used to studying texts and then encounter the physicality, even in digital form, that might give me ideas to look at the physical thing and understand physical elements better. Does that make sense? So I think that's kind of how I see this, and it's a more comprehensive, a more complete representation of the object, and it's not. So the binding, for example, is the cover, the carrier of the information that we're used to seeing in digital form, I would say. I mean, probably talking slightly broader than just digital surrogates. I mean, I'm very interested in what digital research in general and digital methods and, say, multispectral imaging photography and so on and so forth can do for bibliographical research. So where we used to have to interact very closely with the item, which questions can we now answer through imagery, for example, through images, through taking images where of, I don't know, washed out signatures and so on and so forth. So I think digital surrogates can set you off in a direction that will turn you into someone who might be interested in the bibliographical and the physical object.
That's very interesting. I love that. Yeah, that's very cool. Just get you back to it all goes back to the physical and the digital playing together very well. I think that's.
And there's also part of the question is about bibliographical description. So, without images, we need to describe something very, very carefully. But with images, I think a pointer in the particular direction might lead those interested in the full details into exploring those details themselves.
I love it. Very interesting. Awesome. Well, I think we are getting close to time here, and I know usually Sabrina has some closing things, but we have a few more. There's some other questions in the chat. I know that Eleanor has addressed. We also will, folks, if your question is in the chat that we have not gotten to, we'll get that Q&A. I know we have some editors looking at stuff, but we'll look to follow up with you guys after to see if we can answer some specific questions about content within Echo 3. But I wanted to say thank you very much, Karen and Amy, for being here and offering your perspectives. Thank you, Sabrina and the Choice folks, for always making sure the show goes smooth and setting things up. And thank you, everyone, for attending. If you are interested in learning more about 18th Century Collections Online Part 3, kind of how new collections are, we've reframing the research that can be done with 18th Century Collections Online. I encourage you to visit gale.com/echo II and visit and check out some of those examples and see some of the curation work that Gale has done. There's a lot of cool stuff to check out there. And again, thank you, everyone. And I think, Sabrina, I will hand it back over to you.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, I'll just echo you and say thanks so much to Amy, Karen, and Kevin for taking the time to speak with us today. And thank you to our attendees for your questions and your comments. I'd like to remind our viewers that we did record today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from Choice with a link to the recording. Also, if you have a few minutes after the presentation to fill out a brief survey, we would really appreciate it. So thanks again to all of you out there for joining us. We hope you learned something new from the webinar and hope to see you again soon on another session.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.